What is up guys, Greedy Knight here with a video on Charge Blade motion values and damage calculations. I'll go over the damage formula for Charge Blade and what ends up being the best builds to run for each matchup. Let's get into it. Motion values are the percentage of your raw attack, and element multipliers are the equivalent value for your element that are both applied by using specific moves. These dictate how strong an attack is. Typically, these values are not knowledge provided by Capcom, but rather found by the community. It's important to know how strong your moves are and what they get boosted by, so you can invest in skills properly for meta sets. That starts with picking the right weapons for damage tests. The weapons used for the test are the Ardent Paralysis and Water weapons with the respective stats. 220 attack with 5 affinity for the Paralysis weapon, and 200 attack, 10 affinity, and 500 element for the Water weapon. To get the motion values easier, I unequipped all armor and both of the stat boosting charms while making sure my meal buffs did not boost any attack. When testing for motion values, I used the Paralysis Charge Blade and swapped to the Water Ardean Charge Blade when testing for element multipliers. The hit zones for the training dummy are on Kiriniko, namely the front nameplate, which has 100 for cutting when wounded and 30 for elements. White Sharpness has a multiplier of 1.33 for cutting and 1.15 for element, so you include this in the damage equation. The damage test consists of hitting the monster with all of Charge Blade's moves and recording the damage numbers, so we could use algebra to find the motion values later. Then we repeat the process with element file, so we could find the element values. Once you have damage values recorded for every move, you use these system of equations to solve for each motion value and then element multipliers. Use the known damage value, hit zone, sharpness, raw damage, and element to find the unknown motion values and then element multipliers. Files are the simplest ones to solve because they ignore crits, sharpness, and only calc with attack for impact and element for element file. Several moves are classified as file damage, knocking out those moves first. Then we move on to cutting attacks and then shield charge. For the cutting attacks, raw attack values are easier to solve for because there are no additional numbers to keep track of whilst using impact file, but the only caveat is that you ignore critical hits and retest for non-crit hits to keep the equation simple. To find the shield charge multipliers, you divide the shield boosted value from the non-boosted ones for one of your axe attacks and file attacks. Once the motion values are found, then you use them and the same known values to calculate the element multipliers. Typically, it is 1.0 by default, with the exception being Savage Axe ticks and file damage, so this serves as a means to check if your motion values are correct or not. And because Monster Hunter does round, we're allowed to round the motion values to the nearest reasonable decimal. Now that we have the motion values, we can tackle a portion of the damage equation. It is as follows. In summary, the equation is broken down into attack times multipliers plus element times multipliers. The equations used from earlier are just reformatting it so that we could solve for motion values. We'll be focusing on the motion values and multipliers with the goal of getting the total motions and total multipliers of your combos for baseline damage. Since our damage mode is primarily tied to axe mode, we will only be looking at those combos. Charge Blade has 3 main sections of damage: the raw attack, the element, and then the file damage. The motion values and multipliers for Savage Axe ticks are stacked onto each axe chop, so include them in the totals. These are 4 sample combos you use for damage, all involving Savage Axe and your axe chops. For the first combo, it's your Element Discharge combo, Element Discharge 1, 2, Amped Element Discharge, and the AED follow-up. We pull the numbers from the motion value sheet for the respective moves, assuming overcharge files and shield charge, with respective motion values and multipliers. We repeat this process to get the other total motion values and multipliers of other combos. When you sum up your motion values, assuming you land everything, you get 193.6 motion value for the double rend. However, it is actually 1.936 multiplier on your raw attack since it's a percent and you have to divide by 100. The element multiplier is 7.8, which may seem high, but the true element is actually divided by 10, so a 500 element weapon would actually be 50 element times the 7.8 multiplier. The damage equation is the only reason to consider skill investment because the good skills increase damage. Shocker. They affect raw, affinity, element, the crit modifier, and sharpness. We are finding the biggest boost for skill investment by calculating skills individually. We do this by opening the equation back up and plugging in our updated values and then recalculating. For these calculations, we are going to assume 45 cutting hit zones and 20 element hit zones. Here's the skill investment sheet for element and impact file. Impact file can only boost its damage through affinity, crit modifiers, and attack, so you pick the highest boost of the skills calculated. You run crit boost 3 since it provides the most damage for both your element discharge combo and double rend. Naturally, it must be paired with affinity skills like max might, tenderizer, and antivirus to reach that 100% affinity. This is why the affinity is set at 100 so we can calculate the maximum damage with crit boost. Offensive guard is the second best skill to run with impact file because it's also a percentage increase to your raw damage, assuming you can consistently guard. Otherwise, attack up 4 and 5 will be your alternative weapon decoration option without the hassle of needing to guard attacks to keep up the boost. Agitator ends up being the next best max level skill since it provides a hefty boost through affinity and attack. Burst is the best 1-point skill since it outclasses every other level 1 skill and even some level 2 skills. Further points result in diminishing returns since full burst investment doesn't even allow the skill to break the top 5 skills for impact file. It's a different story for element file. The last skill we use is Black Eclipse via Gore Armor. It has inherent synergy with Antivirus and Coalescence while providing its own 10 attack and affinity boost. So it's a more controlled version of Agitator. The rest of the skills fail to justify their use over the top skills, so they are not run unless you get more space on a set. Note that if you want to use Impact File SAD, Artillery 3 is mandatory since it provides the largest boost for Impact File. As for element file, overcharge files, element boosts, and crits define your damage builds. Load shell is an easy recommendation because it allows you to always have easy access to overcharge files, resulting in longer shield charge and more powerful file explosions. Crit boost still keeps its top spot, but burst 5 is the next top dog because it boosts both attack and element. In place of raw attack boost, you run element boost to max out your element damage. You still run the Gore set bonus for Black Eclipse, now coupling it with enough Coalescence to hit the element cap. Lastly, Element Absorption level 1 provides that extra 4 element for 2 minutes, after guarding an elemental hit. For element file, raw attack scales very poorly since element bleeds onto chops, ticks, and file damage, while attack only does so with chops and ticks. Assuming no corruption mantle, a quick damage comparison shows that element is better than raw when at the 45 cutting hit zone and 20 element hit zone. But the monster's body parts are not so agreeable. This is why we calculate damage on every monster to get a better idea of when to use element versus using raw, hence an extensive matchup sheet. These have been calculated using the element discharge combo and guard point SAD formulas, but this time we are plugging in the actual hit zones with respective element hit zones for each monster. Since there are 600 plus entries, the graphs are used to display the maximum damage on a hit zone for each element to showcase what matchups can benefit from element file. This is a reasonable assumption because Savage Axe is a targeted playstyle and hitting good hit zones is its priority, so even if a monster has one good hit zone, it will count as a good matchup. This format also compares the strongest between raw and element damage. These are your targets for respective elements. Nursilla changes to a thunder weakness when breaking its various parts, so you should bring it as your backup in that hunt. Note that Arkveld and Gormagala are exceptions to the element rules because they tuck their good hit zones behind mechanics. Gormagala for its antennae and Arkveld for its chains, while the rest of their body is pretty resistant to element. The gap in damage between raw and element isn't large enough to justify using it over Impact File and Paralysis, because Gormagala and Arkveld are hyperactive monsters, leaving little to no natural openings for Element File to exploit. It results in more time spent fighting the monster rather than actually doing a lot of damage. Impact File Paralysis allows you to stunlock the monster and just focus the head, and other good hit zones. While Element does more damage in favorable matchups, it requires more unreasonable Arden rolls, knowledge of the matchup, and taking advantage of natural topples to match if not surpass the para-stunlock shenanigans of the Paralysis Arden build. Nothing is stopping you from using raw builds on everything instead of investing into Element File. These factors limit the benefits of using Element File over Impact File. Time Attackers are even showcasing Paralysis as the dominant build because of the Corruption Mantle and wounds only boosting raw damage, ease of access to the build by only needing one Ardent weapon, and the ability to script fights much easier with stun locking. However, a reason to consider Element File is that it teaches fundamentals the hard way. You can't rely on immobilizing the monster, you actually fight it to learn the matchup. You learn the innate topple mechanics and learn to interact with the monster without any hopes of KOs or paralysis to save your hide. It is a better recommendation than using the Paralysis Crutch for upcoming Charge Blade users because you are forced to learn Monster Hunter, not a mobile punching bag hunter. In exchange for all these caveats, you get higher damage over the course of the hunt. Element File teaches you more about the game in the long run, weighing your options for every hunt, and understanding matchups is part of using Element File, as opposed to using the one Paralysis Charge Blade fits all mentality. While you don't have to follow the Element File agenda, that's why I'll be sticking with it. Like if this video is useful to you, consider subscribing if you want to see more Charge Blade content like this. Comment down below your thoughts. That's all I got for this one. Greedy Knight, signing out.